Thank you very much for joining the panel Emerging Strategy and Context in Inclusive Entrepreneurship. I am Francesco Di Lorenzo and from Copenhagen Business School, and I co-organized with Astrid Marinoni for Georgia Tech this panel. This panel is, let me promote a little bit the IG, so it's the result of a joint effort of a beautiful team that have been thinking throughout the previous months, what can we offer to the community in terms of topic to reflect on, possibility to somehow advance some thinking and therefore hopefully research on important topics, and this panel is the result of one of this effort. So just one word about it. So entrepreneurship certainly is a chance for everybody, but also for a specific group, right, to think about their career, both in kind of large firms, but also in entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial ventures. So the fascinating element of these marginalized or special groups is that perhaps initially they receive less attention, also in the light of the fact that in advanced economies, maybe we haven't not observed much of those groups or differences compared to those groups. But nowadays, the story is certainly different. We think about all the geopolitical crisis that creates a lot of flows of migrants and refugees, then this becomes a question also for advanced economy, how do we deal with it, right? Not only, obviously, the gender inequalities are more too much inequality, so now we are dealing with that. So what does it actually mean for firms, entrepreneurial activities, and eventually individuals that face those questions? So what we did, we collected these two and few others perspective on the idea of how can we include through entrepreneurship these groups, if you wish, put it in the center. And so we invited 4 panelists. We have Sarah, Zeke, Izin, and Justin that will guide us through a different example or what from their research, recent and maybe rather an overview of what they've been learning in doing research on this topic, which for each of them is certainly something important. So we have 10-12 minutes for each of the panelists, and we hold the questions until the end when everybody will have the chance to interact with our panelists. With no further delay or due, I invite Sarah to join us here and start this hopefully a very interesting panel for all of you. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, and I guess we have to use the mics because this is being recorded. Otherwise, I might put my mic down, but okay. So I'm probably going to give more of an overview and not talk specifically about individual projects that I've been working on. I don't often dabble directly in the entrepreneurship space in terms of my own research, although I do have a project with NELDUT that's looking at innovation accelerators and trying to understand the degree to which they actually accelerate and under what conditions in particular they do that. And that got me kind of interested in this field. I came at it more from like, oh, this is a space to look at gender inequality, and this is an interesting opportunity to see if some kind of structural intervention would actually work to improve outcomes. And what we find in that study is that it can improve outcomes, but they have to actually be deliberate about their efforts to help women, and that this is not always the case in all contexts. For example, we're seeing that actually acceleration often has a negative impact for women entrepreneurs in developing economies who go through these accelerators, and that may be in part because the accelerators are not designed and tailored for their needs. So it's a point that was just in a corporate strategy session this morning. It's a point about thinking about not just jamming women or people of color or previously incarcerated people into the existing system and hoping that it works. What we want to talk about here is how could we think about, what the entrepreneurship system could look like if we actually thought, designed it around the more marginalized people. And I have a few other questions. So these are just some thoughts and questions. And I also had an opportunity to be discussing at the Academy on a panel on inequality and entrepreneurship. And it's very clear to me that there's a lot of emerging research and young scholars who are working in this area, which is incredibly exciting. So, the idea when we think about social inequality and entrepreneurship is that, somehow in the face of some kind of labor market discrimination, whether it's gender, social class, previous incarceration, membership in the LGBTQ community, race, that this is going to be some kind of solution. Okay, you can't get a proper job in a firm that has benefits and these kinds of things. Entrepreneurship is going to be a great opportunity for you to kind of level the playing field for yourself economically. And so the question then becomes, well, who can actually get into entrepreneurship? What kind of entrepreneurship can they get into? What barriers do they face once they're entrepreneurs, and what impact does this entrepreneurship have on their careers? There's a lot of interesting research about, well, if you are an entrepreneur, does that make it easier or harder for you to then transition from entrepreneurship into standard paid employment, or go back and forth? And then the question that I then raise about all of this is, when is entrepreneurship actually a bad idea? Why do we glorify this? I mean, I have the opportunity here in Canada to spend a lot of time with some of our leading policymakers, and we have a minister for women and gender equality in Canada. We have another minister for small business and entrepreneurship, and for them, the solution to some of the inequalities that they observe in the Canadian economy is entrepreneurship. Like, let's just fund women's entrepreneurship, as if that's really the, finally we got them to fund. We now have universal $10 a day childcare, or eventually once it's implemented, finally we got them to have a conversation about childcare. But there's this idea that somehow entrepreneurship is this magic panacea, as opposed to thinking about how to fix regular employment so that it actually is possible for women. Or when we talk about previously incarcerated people, often, entrepreneurship is their only path out because employers are unwilling to hire them. And so I also want to kind of raise this question about what, when are we over glorifying entrepreneurship simply as a solution to what is actually a systemic problem about employment in our economy, and not really about how great entrepreneurship is? Because of course, high risk, high reward, there's lots of great things about being an entrepreneur, but there's also a lot of costs and risks that go with that. And not every, why, I always wonder, why are we forcing the most marginalized people into the riskiest jobs? And so that's when I think about entrepreneurship and inequality, I first think about that question. Now, of course, assuming you do want to be an entrepreneur, then these other questions come into play, like what are the barriers for someone to get into entrepreneurship? We know, for example, and is someone keeping time? Is someone going to flash something at me? Just flash whatever you need to flash. I don't know. Where am I on my? Oh, I am 5 minutes. Perfect. Okay. So, all these statistics about, we have all this venture capital system, and we have it in Canada. We try to emulate Silicon Valley. And I always keep saying, why are we trying to emulate Silicon Valley? That's an engine for inequality. Why don't we try some other different kinds of financing? But we know a lot of entrepreneurial financing goes to people from the dominant class, that women get very little of it. People of color, women of color in particular, get almost none of it. Previously incarcerated people get almost none of it. Like, these are, these questions about, well, what kind of entrepreneurship can you ultimately then get into? And a lot of times our research on entrepreneurship really focuses on that high tech, on that Silicon Valley type of entrepreneurship. And of course, that's very important. That's an important growth engine for our economy. But a lot of people are entrepreneurs, like opening nail salons, or creating a small consulting firm, or creating a delivery business, starting a gym. There's lots of small businesses that people, I'm just getting my curtains redone in my house, and I have a woman-owned business, which is just a woman doing curtains. She's not a high-tech, high-growth, but she's definitely an entrepreneur, and she's definitely taking on the risk that entails. So I think that we often neglect some of these kinds of questions when we're thinking about, a lot of the research tends to think about, like, how can we get people into that system, which we know is a system that actually doesn't really work for most people. And so those are some of the questions that I raise. What do we think, what are some of the research challenges that then go with that? For me, it's, how do we define entrepreneurship? How can researchers reclaim entrepreneurship from the high-tech, high-growth context? Like, could we can we talk about entrepreneurship, all these different forms of entrepreneurship? I see my colleague Stefan, who studies entrepreneurship in Africa. It doesn't look like Silicon Valley entrepreneurship, but that is a crucial part of entrepreneurship, and we should be considering that. And what applies and what doesn't apply in different entrepreneurial contexts. You know, a lot of times people say, oh, well, you're studying, you know, entrepreneurs in Africa. Does that really generalize to entrepreneurship? And that question about generalizability, I want to point out, is a little bit of a colonial project. We're basically saying if it doesn't generalize to a North American high-tech Silicon Valley model, then it's somehow not important, as opposed to asking, do these models that we've developed about entrepreneurship out of Silicon Valley really apply to the vast majority of people in this world? What counts as success in entrepreneurship? Again, is it an exit with a huge payout, a transition to more traditional employment? Is it sustainable income? I think we need to broaden our dependent variable in terms of what we think about as success if we are really going to study inclusive entrepreneurship. And then I think we need to think about supply and demand factors. Something that initially got me into this inquiry about entrepreneurship was thinking about this, argument that women don't ask for money, or they, it's all women are not risk takers, which, we actually know that those things are not true. The research has shown that these are things that are not true, but we tend to think that therefore the problem, there's no pipeline. And so people say, well, the problem is really a supply problem. But a lot of research that I have done and research that I consume, and Isabel Fernandez-Mateo and I wrote a piece for Organization Science that was just an intro to a special issue. But in the intro, we really argue that we need to consider supply and demand side factors, and actually not even supply and demand, but how those interact. Like, women may not ask because they know that there's unlikely that they're going to get the funding, and that's a demand problem. So you see those interactions. So I think that's something we could address much more, is the ways that those are intertwined. And then how can we apply an intersectional lens on research? So not just race, not just gender, not just previous incarceration. Like, I know, for example, Damon Phillips and Kylie Wong do this incredible work on previously incarcerated people in entrepreneurship, and all of it's on men, or most of it's on men. Why? Because that's where the N is. There's just not enough women to study, and so then I'm like, well, then how do we get that intersectional lens? Is the answer different for previously incarcerated women than previously incarcerated men? We don't actually really know, because we are constrained in our research. So I think those are important questions that we can ask as we study entrepreneurship. And then just some open questions. I'll conclude with this. What are some alternative funding and acceleration models that might actually work? When I said don't jam people into the existing system, maybe we can just create new systems. What is the role of family in entrepreneurship? There's a whole field of research on family enterprise, and then there's a whole field of research on entrepreneurship, and I think they could be more tightly coupled, and also tightly coupled with questions about work-family balance and things like that. Again, research that tends to happen in the OB world, but really could have huge implications in entrepreneurship. How might the entrepreneurship dynamics change depending upon the context? This is, for example, the work that Nell and I are doing. And what insights could come from alternative forms of organizing, co-ops, hybrids, and other things like that? Do we always have to think about it in the traditional form of the firm? And I think that those are some real opportunities. And I should just mention, we convened a couple of years ago at the Institute for Gender and the Economy a whole multi-day roundtable during the pandemic on race, gender, and entrepreneurship, and have written a report on that. For those of you who are interested, it's a great summary. Go to gendereconomy.org if you want to see more on that. But I think this is a really exciting panel, and I'm just so grateful that you invited me to have an intervention here. So thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to stand here. Thanks again. It's it's a privilege to be here and speak along with my fellow panelists. I'm going to take a different approach and obviously cover a different topic. Let me start with a really big picture thing here. So in 2017, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine came out with a state-of-the-art report on what are the economic consequences of immigration. okay? It's really good. If you have the stomach to go through it, it's actually very, very good. It's long and authoritative. It has 10 chapters. 2 of them are sort of introduction and historical background. 1 of them focuses on whether immigrants sort of assimilate in certain ways. 2 focus on the question of do immigrants how do they affect the jobs and wages of native workers? 1 focuses on sort of these very high-level GDP and macro effects. 3 whole chapters focus on how do immigrants affect public coffers, okay? Now, none of this seems relevant to people in this room, okay? And yet, and then there's a conclusion. So there's no chapters on innovation, how immigrants affect innovation. There's no chapters on how immigrants relate to entrepreneurship, which is completely mind-blowing. Okay? There's no chapter on immigrants affect investment and capital in the economy. Nothing on the role of firms and managers in all of this. Okay? And so my point is really simple. The public conversation does not include us when it comes to immigration, which is absolutely crazy because we have a lot to say about this. Okay? So I'll say more about this in just a second. Why are we important to this conversation? Let me go back to the basic production function that you learn in Intro to Economics, okay? So this is how Paul Romer would express the production function. He would have the labor and capital that usually we have, and he would add an R for what he calls research or knowledge, okay? Now, we matter because when we think about how immigrants affect the economy, right? An economist would typically think about it this way. Immigrants affect these 3 aspects of the production function, and then out comes something called economic growth. But where does talent and labor work, and who recruits talent, right? Where does most capital and investment happen, right? What are the entities that do it, and where does most innovation and knowledge creation happen? Well, we know this. It happens inside firms. Okay? And so we have the opportunity to open up that black box and really explain how immigration affects the economy. Immigrants interact with the economy either because they work at firms, but also because they disproportionately start firms, right? Immigrants, in fact, start firms at a much higher rate than natives everywhere, not just in the US, but everywhere. So if we were talking about inclusion, the real question should be why aren't natives more included in entrepreneurship? Because immigrants are more than carrying their weight, okay? So this is very, very big picture and very macro. But then let me, with that context and with the challenge that we have to be more relevant to the public conversation, let me suggest some questions that we should be asking and answering in our research on this group of immigrants and entrepreneurship. So we still need to understand why it is that immigrants have a really disproportionately high rate of entrepreneurship. A little bit like Sarah was mentioning, one of the answers is that immigrants often are disadvantaged in the labor market, whether it's for discrimination or other reasons, and so therefore they resort to necessity entrepreneurship. But immigrants are also disproportionately represented in really high-end entrepreneurship, right? Really high-tech, high-growth, VC-funded. So we actually still don't understand exactly why that happens. There's some theories out there, but we don't have good evidence on that. We also don't really understand what's unique about immigrant versus native-founded startups in a lot of different ways. Here in the slides, I just have a few. For example, why is it that immigrant-funded startups innovate more? Okay. What kind of investors do they attract, and what difference does it make that they attract different kinds of investors? What kinds of markets, whether they're product or geographic markets, do these startups pursue? And how do they affect their surrounding communities differently? Is it different when you're in a city, a neighborhood that has a lot of immigrant founders versus native founders? How does that affect the non-immigrant community around it? We don't know the answer to any of these questions. Also, what's different about immigrants joining startups versus, that should say, yeah, founding startups, okay? And also, I'm very interested in how the presence of immigrants in a community that aren't necessarily entrepreneurs, just the fact that you grew up around a group of foreigners, perhaps a diverse group of foreigners, how does that affect you, your propensity to entrepreneurship as a native, okay, and what kind of entrepreneurship you engage in? We have some suggestive evidence that immigrants make natives more entrepreneurial, but we need to learn more about that. Okay? Anyway, my point is that there's a lot of unanswered questions, and the exciting part is that I see a lot of white space to be filled. So if I now overlay the three elements of the production function with all of the mechanisms and theories that we have in our field, then we can fill every cell with lots of research papers, right? So if you're a doctoral student, just pick a cell, pick an intersection here that is interesting to you and fill it, right? There's a whole career just in filling out that cell. If you're already a faculty member and a doctoral student comes to you and says, what should I study? Pick a cell, right? So there's a lot of great opportunities here. You know, I'm trying to make my own dent in my own little way, but it's amazing how much open space we still have. So let me finish with this. This report comes out every 20 years. So the latest one is from 2017. The previous one was from 1997. What will the 2037 report include, right? And I would say the challenge for us is to be relevant, because we have a lot to say right there. And I think we're already doing a lot of work that, you know, should have been included in 2017, but we have the opportunity to be more relevant. So that's the challenge I would leave you with. Let me finish with something that is shamelessly self-promoting, but my publisher tells me I need to be this way. I have tried to make my own dent in this, so I have a book coming out on this topic, which does speak a lot about entrepreneurship and other topics as well. So if you have $30 to spare, please buy it and tell your friends about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. All right, can you hear me? I'm gonna stand here because I have two hands and too many things. My name is Ishin Güler. I'm from UNC Chapel Hill, and I'm gonna tell you about a journey that I've been on for the last 3 or 4 years, and I'm gonna try to walk you through that in 12 minutes, so good luck to me. This is actually based on a dissertation by a former student of mine, Robert Hill. So he has been generous enough to take me on this journey that has been very meaningful. And what I want to do is to invite more of you, encourage more of you on this journey of thinking about entrepreneurship in non-traditional contexts. This is entrepreneurship training for the formerly incarcerated, right? There is a problem of mass incarceration, at least in the United States. There are 2 million, almost 2 million Americans who are incarcerated. The cost to the United States is around $80 billion a year. On the plot there, you're seeing the number of incarcerated individuals over time increase dramatically. So you may have heard of this saying that US has almost 5% of the world population, but over 20% of the incarcerated. Obviously, as you can imagine, this disproportionately affects minorities. So one of the problems that we're facing in helping previously incarcerated individuals is that they're having difficulty getting reintegrated into the society. Within 3 years, there's a very high rate of going back to prison. So we call this reincarceration or recidivism. The rate is around 36%. One of the reasons is they are facing significant barriers to employment. And so, as already has been mentioned, Kylie Huang and Damon Phillips have done this great work thinking about entrepreneurship as a potential path for reentry and economic opportunity. But the problem we're having, or at least part of the problem, is that they may lack the skills to start a business, so there may be a skill gap, right? Or even get into gainful employment. And this is where we come in, because we know about entrepreneurship, we know about entrepreneurship training. So can we use what we know to help this community? We have been working with Texas Prison Entrepreneurship Program for this. For the last, as I said, 3-4 years, we've been working with them. They are the largest and oldest prison entrepreneurship training program. So we were able to build this collaboration that proved to be very, very fruitful. We did the first study with them. This was an observational study where we tried to understand the impact of the program. Right? So this is a program evaluation. When you study a program like this, the issue is you don't know whether the program is effective because they're selecting the individuals who would anyway be successful in life, or whether whether the training is what makes the difference, right? We don't know what the treatment effect is. What we were able to do was to get data from the program on previous graduates between 2009 and 2016. About 2,500 of those have received the training. The rest have been admitted to the program but could not receive training because they got sick or they were granted early parole. So when we look at these two different communities, these are just raw numbers that you're seeing. There's a huge difference in recidivism rates, which shows that there's a big treatment effect of joining the program. So armed with that, we started to think about what can we do to help the program do even better, right? And so we got to thinking about how is the prison population different from the other populations where we provide entrepreneurship training. And just like Sarah was mentioning, this is very different from your high-tech, high-growth entrepreneurs, right? One of the issues is that I think in that literature we do assume, rightly so, that people who come to accelerators or incubators, they are coachable, they're motivated to get the training, they're motivated to start the next big startup. Whereas in the prison population, there is a skill gap, they know there is a skill gap, right? So this is what our OB colleagues call self-efficacy. They wonder if they can get there. Also, they know that they're gonna face stigma. They know that they're gonna face these barriers upon release from prison. So they are facing stigma and they don't really trust the people to help them, right? So there's a big issue in motivating these individuals to even think about this as an option for their future. We observed this in the application rates to the program to start with. We also observed this in the high dropout rates. Dropout rates are around 40%. So these are the two problems we wanted to tackle with the two projects that we have started. One of them was to think about how to reduce dropouts upon entering the program. And so this has happened just before COVID. And the program turned to a correspondence course at the time. So they gave us the opportunity to manipulate the initial welcome letter that was included in this correspondence course. And we manipulated two aspects of it. One was a welcome, so it's a testimonial that we added. We didn't change the content, just the welcome. And we tried using two different welcome sources based on ideas around homophily. One is, does it make a difference if you're invited to the program by previous graduate of the program versus an academic expert? And the second idea was, did it matter how we framed the testimonial? Did it matter if we talked about the gains from the program versus avoiding mistakes and going back to prison? So this is a pre-registered RCT that we conducted with 3 cohorts that received the training during COVID, 629 participants, randomized, stratified by race and age. I'm not going to show you a whole lot of detail. I'm happy to talk later, but these are, again, very raw results. What we are seeing is that the one on the very right is the control group, and the dropout rates are around 50%, completion rates are around 50%. We see a significant difference in 2 of the groups that we tested. 2 of the treatment arms are significant. One is that when they receive a testimonial framed as a gain from a former inmate, so talking about success from a former inmate, they seem to respond very strongly to that. And the program completion rates are almost higher than 70% for that treatment arm. They also seem to respond positively to experts, academics, talking about a loss frame, how to avoid mistakes when you become an entrepreneur. And that also seems to have over 60% response rate. So this is intriguing. But I'm going to leave it here, tell you also about the third study that we have conducted. And this idea was, how can we encourage more people to apply to the program to start with, if the program is so great? And here we started to think about resource access as a motivator. So if they are having a skill gap, and if they are also having a resource gap, maybe they don't even bother applying to the program. And we know from entrepreneurship literature that different resources are important for entrepreneurs: financial resources, human capital, social capital, legitimacy. These are all needed. We know that entrepreneurs, in our models, usually people decide to become an entrepreneur and then somehow assemble these resources or mobilize resources from different sources, or they, big collage, they put together what they have. But what our thinking is that even before becoming an entrepreneur, your anticipated access to these resources can act as a barrier or a motivator to becoming an entrepreneur. And in fact, for former inmates, of course, there are barriers to accessing each of these resources. And again, we know this from Kylie's work. So in this experiment, this is also an RCT pre-registered. What we did was so here's how the program works. This is an all-male program. You're very right. The female version has just started. Very right. All-male program. So all male inmates within the state of Texas, they receive a flyer from the program when there is 3 years left in their prison sentence, and then about 30% apply. So what we want to do is to increase that, right? So we have the 1,300 inmates from one recruiting cycle, all potential applicants who received these different treatment conditions. And each of the treatment conditions basically advertises a resource that the program provides. None of it is wrong. It's, you know, the program provides all these resources, the education, the mentor network, the access to financial capital like a seed grant, and a certificate from Baylor which provides a legitimacy treatment. So in each of these letters we inserted a single resource access as a motivator, and then we had two composite conditions with social and legitimacy and financial capital and legitimacy, again stratified based on race and age. Showing you the raw results with treatment arm, by treatment arm. What you'll see there is that now the left-hand side is the control, and again, around 30% application rate based on receiving. Financial capital, as you might imagine, is a significant motivator, so we get a bump from there, an increase in response rates to around 35%. The legitimacy treatment was also, it resulted in a higher application rate, around 36%. It wasn't statistically significant. So now I'm going to tell you an interesting story if I have a minute. What you can see is that the composite conditions are actually worse than the other ones. And our thinking is that, so you may be thinking, why not just put all 4 things in the letter, right? Well, there's a trade-off. They don't want to read too long letters. That's actually demotivating, as you can see there. Anyway, so we got the results. They're not statistically significant about legitimacy, and we're sad, right? It's not going to be a paper, maybe. But then we show it to the program manager. The program manager says, well, I don't care about statistical significance. I'm just going to use that letter. 36% is better than 30%. And lo and behold, he sends this letter in the next cycle. And we were able to, OK, so this is my cue for 10 minutes. In the next cycle, he sends our letter with the legitimacy treatment. And we were able to get the before letters as well as the after letters and the outcomes, right? So now this is our observational, post hoc study. And what we're finding is that before we did the treatment, yes, the application rates were almost exactly 30%, similar to our experiment. The ones that went out after the experiment, almost exactly equal to our legitimacy treatment, 36% application rate. Of course, now the samples are bigger and it's significant, So I think this is very interesting to me. If you know me and you know my research, this is like a big left turn for me. It's not related to my prior work. But I found it extremely rewarding and meaningful and important to be thinking about these new dependent variables. I had never thought about recidivism in my life. Profit, growth, innovation, yes. But maybe we have developed skills that we can contribute to these other communities, and why not use our skills for thinking about new kinds of problems. The questions that I wrote are very similar to, I think, so I'm very aligned with how Sarah is thinking about that. I don't think everybody should become an entrepreneur. I don't think that's the aim. So even after attending the program, only 30% entrepreneurship rate, entry to entrepreneurship. That's what we observe. So 30% attendance, and then 30% of those become entrepreneurs. That's around 10%. So the 90% are not going to go into entrepreneurship. So I'm not saying that this is the panacea for all problems, right? But for some people, maybe this is a good solution. And who are those people? And what do we do for them, right? How do we provide the right training? What's the content that they'll benefit the most from? How do we define success for them? Is recidivism just enough? You may have noticed in the slides, I never said that the mechanism is through entrepreneurship. So I'm not even sure that what the main benefit of attending the program is becoming an entrepreneur necessarily. Maybe it's something else, right? So there's so many more we can think about, learn, and explore about these questions. And yeah, I'm inviting all of you to join me. Yeah, thank you.
Last but not least,
Howdy, everyone. Thanks. I'm Justin Webb, and I was asked to speak on the informal economy and its relationship with inclusive entrepreneurship. Informal economy is a really interesting, complex, nuanced sort of space to consider inclusive entrepreneurship. So let me kind of first give you the definition of what we're talking about when we talk about informal economy. So we're talking about activities that occur outside of formal institutions, but still that exist within informal institutions. And so things, the definition that we kind of talked about was that these are activities that are illegal and yet still legitimate. And that's very much a developed economy perspective, and I'll come back to that momentarily, but skirting labor laws, skirting property rights, skirting tax laws, and so forth, right? And millions of undocumented workers in the US, but that's a global phenomenon as well. Trillion plus market annually in counterfeit goods, and so these are things that are illegal technically, but then still, just given the size of them, clearly legitimate, socially acceptable to large groups of individuals in society. Right, and the informal economy exists because there's this incongruence between formal and informal institutions being the laws, regulations, and so forth. Informal institutions being the norms, values, and beliefs within in society, and you have, again, diversity within society and a lot of individuals that differ in terms of their norms, values, and beliefs, and so you get these large groups that have norms, values, and beliefs that differ then from the laws and regulations. In developed economy context, we make this distinction between illegal yet legitimate, but then when you look at developing and emerging economies, something that's probably more prevalent is the fact that you have these formal institutional voids, so the formal institutions aren't even in with it. They're absent, and so in some cases, the formal institutional voids can be filled by informal institutions. Informal institutions will govern the activity versus formal institutions, and so in that case, that's kind of informal economy as well. So in developing and emerging economies, the informal economy can account for about 30 to 40% of GDP, and it can be over 50% of GDP in some developing economies. So very significant space of economic activity, and it's complex in the sense that there are a lot of different reasons why people participate within the informal economy. I've already talked about the fact that, well, in many contexts there's formal institutional voids, and so then the informal institution governs. But you also have context cases where you got formal institutional rules that exclude certain individuals from participating in the formal economy. So you got illegal immigrants, and then technically they can't register a business, have the licenses, certifications, whatever else, and so they operate in the informal economy. You can have formal institutional corruption, and this is an institutional enemy sort of perspective where individuals see their formal institutional actors acting in corrupt ways, and they say, okay, well, if you can circumvent the rules, then why can't I as well? Formal institutional incompetence and failure, so they might not be corrupt, but they're incompetent, and then they're misallocating resources, and formal institutional inefficiencies go along with that as well. But if they're misallocating resources, and well, why should I contribute to the tax revenues if you're going to misallocate them or allocate them into something else, waste them? So I'm going to operate in the informal economy. And then as well, you got formal institutional attempts, which are very well-minded sort of attempts to ensure important things like security, fairness, sustainability, and whatever else. But those environmental regulations and those labor laws and whatever, they all create costs. And then individuals can rationally say that I want to avoid those costs, so I'm going to operate in the informal economy. So a lot of different reasons why folks operate there. In developing and emerging economies, though, another important wrinkle is that the informal economy is a buffer. When the formal institutions fail to provide formal employment options, then people have to subsist some way. And formal institutional actors realize, well, if we just monitor and enforce things and penalize people and imprison people, there's going to be civil unrest. All they're trying to do is put food on the table. So there's almost this negotiated compromise approach that you stay out of these formal market areas, and we won't enforce you as heavily. We'll allow you to do what you need to do to subsist. So then coming back to the theme, is the informal economy a form of inclusive entrepreneurship? Well, if you look at the OECD definition of it, well, it's just individuals having the opportunity to start and run a business. Well, the informal economy is a space where people can start and run a business, in which case then, yes, it's an inclusive sort of space. But then if you go and look at other definitions, like I just pulled this one from Bakker and McMullen, but it's inclusive entrepreneurship. It's more about having a level playing field where individuals are not disadvantaged by the creation and enforcement of laws and norms. Well, individuals that operate in the informal economy aren't able to draw upon the benefits of formal institutions. And they're disadvantaged in that sense. They cannot operate as efficiently. They cannot gain access to certain markets or contracts and such, in which case then they're operating at a disadvantage. So by that definition, the informal economy is not inclusive. And it's very much this chicken and egg causality dilemma. Formal institutions want most folks to operate in the formal economy. They need the tax revenues to build the formal institutions. And so they want folks that are operating to pay their taxes, to register businesses, to get the appropriate license certifications. Right? And the formal institutions are changing their policies to encourage formalization. They're monitoring and enforcing informal market spaces. And they're investing in educational and mentorship programs to help folks meet formal market standards and so forth. Right? But again, chicken and egg sort of thing. Without those tax revenues, the formal institutions can't provide the incentives to make it worthwhile for people to register, certify, whatever. All right. As a scholar that studies institutional theory, this is kind of my view on things. I view formal institutions as critical to development. They provide many benefits that broaden markets. Right? They provide the utilities and the infrastructure that broaden markets and, so that folks can operate more efficiently and effectively across these broader markets. They ensure the markets by providing security and safety. Right? And then all of these benefits that the formal institutions provide can enhance nutrition and health within society, education, all these positive quality of life outcomes. But there's an assumption there that if those assumptions aren't met, strong formal economy, if the formal institutions don't act in the best interest of society, if they're not competent, then formal institutions can actually be worse. And even when you got good formal institutions, as you know, in developed economies we do, you got these other questions of institutional efficiency, fairness, too much control, whatever else. So things can be worse. So all of that in mind, asked to come up with questions to consider for future research. And here are some questions that I thought are quite relevant. How and what order can formal institutions develop to most effectively provide a foundation for formalization and inclusiveness, right? So what communities, if you aren't getting the tax revenues that you need, how are you going to allocate the scarce resources that you do get? Do you incrementally grow out from the developed spaces that you do have? Do you focus on certain formal institutions? So should we develop education first, or should we develop safety and security first? Should we develop utilities? What should we do? And from a complementary standpoint, not only about the infrastructure and such, but then what about the policies to incentivize folks to participate more in the formal economy? I have a paper working on now. It's on La Salada, which is the world's largest informal market space. It's in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Really interesting space. And it's an informal market space that has become semi-formalized over time. And so with that, what level of exclusion informal economic activity is ideal? We're always going to have informal market activity, but then how wide do informal markets exclude? What's interesting about La Salada is they've become semi-formalized over time. They're still informal in a sense, but they're much more organized and formal about things. And part of their rules that they've implemented are now excluding other informal economy entrepreneurs. So you've got this huge space where informal economy entrepreneurs operate, but then if you can't pay essentially the registration to operate within that informal market space, you can't come in. And then they operate right on the outskirts of the informal market space on the train tracks. And then they get enforced by the formal institutions. So that's interesting that the informal is excluding the other informal. How should formal institutions prioritize the various institutional problems to be solved? Like we've got all these grand challenges: illegal immigration, poverty, whatever else. And so where does inclusive entrepreneurship fall among those different priorities? How do you change a culture of exclusion when folks don't want to necessarily be included? People have operated in the informal economy their entire lives. That's what they know. And there's a wariness of the formal institutions, so they don't necessarily want to formalize in some cases, right? So should you be trying to do that? And then we always focus on changing the formal institution. What can we change about the formal institutional policies? What can we do about formal institutional investments? Does it actually need to start internally in the informal economy? If you look at La Salada again as another example, they've semi-formalized, they've strengthened their informal institutions to operate more efficiently and effectively. Instead of starting with the formal institutions, should we be starting with the informal? So that's all I got.
All right, so I think I invite you maybe to to sit in a chair. So Justin, you can just stay. I steal one microphone. Yeah. Okay. Cool. I open a question from the audience. Okay. Maybe I collect a couple of them and then.
Thank you all for now we're
Yeah. Okay. So nice to do that.
close.
Okay.
Now?
Sometimes.
Okay, all right. Thank you all for your wonderful presentations. Super interesting stuff. I think what I'm curious about is, okay, all right, no, it's okay. All right, I think we're getting somewhere. So I think what's really interesting to me is how research in all of these areas that you're outlining has a lot of public policy implications, right? And I think something that was raised is sort of becoming part of this public policy conversation. And I think oftentimes maybe perhaps business schools aren't necessarily thought of as a place where this kind of research gets produced. And so I was wondering, Sarah, it sounds like you've had some success engaging with politicians. And also from Zeke, it sounds like you want us to be part of this conversation about immigration. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how do we connect with people who actually have an impact on this policy? I mean, in my case, it relates to sort of economic development, but I'm curious about how I can also become part of that kind of conversation.
Yes, I collect another one. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you again for the presentations. I'm just curious, you talked about several specific, underrepresented groups, incarcerated, immigrants, others. But I'm curious if you have thoughts on specific, other specific underrepresented groups that you think we should be studying more. I'm thinking people with disabilities, people in rural areas versus urban areas, any other specific ideas of, underrepresented groups that should be studied in this context.
Thank you. So should we start maybe to address this couple of questions, and then we can keep going? Sarah, would you like to start maybe?
On the public policy front, Stefan, you and I have the advantage of being in Canada, which is so much easier to be a big fish in this small pond. I mean, we're geographically big, but we're a small country. I can connect you to the minister that will help you talk about global affairs and the feminist foreign policy. So I think part of it is, finding the connections to do that. But the other thing is, in terms of getting into those personal conversations. But the other thing is in participating in those kinds of reports that Zeke, that you talked about. One of the things we try to do at the Institute for Gender and the Economy, and I think is a real role for any research center. So if any of you are affiliated or could be affiliated with a research center, is to work, take the time, which I would recommend is better to do after you're tenured than before, but depending upon the research teams you have, to use those centers as a platform for putting out a report or putting out an infographic that summarizes your findings, or and using that to leverage. I think that's one of the really important roles that research centers can play, is that translational role to get ideas out. And then maybe eventually in your life you write a book like Zeke has just written, or things like that. But I think there's multiple different avenues, but you can actually get a lot of bang for your buck by just putting out a simple infographic that translates some of your ideas, and that can get picked up by people. I don't know if other people have thoughts.
I haven't certainly had the high level of success or involvement that Sarah has, but I'm trying, as you can tell. So just a few things. I think that I agree with your premise, Stefan, that we're really terrible at this, and we have no incentives, and in some cases disincentives. So I just think we need to care and we need to try, right? And a few ideas on how do we care and we try. We put so many years into getting a paper published, and then it gets published, and we might celebrate and go have a drink, and then we're done, right? And we've created this amazing content that's actually quite useful. So the more I've spent time in policy circles, the more I'm shocked at, like, essentially people that are kind of morons and don't know what they're talking about are actually, like, have the ear of policymakers. And so we have important things to say. So I think part of the incentive to try is that we actually do know things that are useful. Like, I think of your papers based in Togo, and, like, you've discovered some things that are like useful and rigorous, right? And you have something to say. The other thing that I've realized is that our work is so jargony. And the way we write papers, it's very hard actually for people to read our papers. Like, this norm of, like, the 85 pages of background and the deductive hypothesis that we really didn't deduct, they came from the result. So I think if we change the norms in our field of how we write papers, I think our research would also be easier to digest. In the meantime, I would say in the post-publication process, just caring about, like, write a LinkedIn post about a paper that you publish, but try to really think of what would it apply to, what would be a real world example or an issue that's happening right now that we can speak to. Using social media. My colleague Ethan Malik is perhaps an outlier, but he's always putting up stuff on social media, but he's very good at taking academic research and explaining it to, like, the average person. And I think that's a skill that we can learn. You don't have to be perhaps born good at it like Ethan was. The other thing is policymakers really do want to hear. We just have to go to the circles in which they move. So if you're in Canada, well, Sarah will help you, but where I live in the US, most schools, for example, most universities have public policy and lobbying arms, and they have relationships with public policy makers. So I think it's a matter of joining some of those networks. Writing a book like I have, I don't recommend doing it before tenure, but anyway, those are some things. I think if you generate the content, there will be opportunities, but it's about generating content that isn't our typical, SMJ paper.
I agree.
I don't have much to say in terms of actually, but I guess the one thing I would say is that we do provide a different perspective than, at least on the informal economy stuff. I think about most of the policy implications have come from economists, maybe some sociologists, and they're studying a much higher level. We're down studying the individuals, their networks and such, and so we provide a perspective that they have not considered, which is important to their policy implications. So it's important for us to get out there and make those connections. I can't say that I'm doing it, but yeah.
I wanted to. Hello. It works. I wanted to answer the second question too about other populations that you could study or that are not as studied. I mean, there's so many. Pick anything. But I was thinking of Madeline Tubiana's and Trish Rubottom's work on sex workers as entrepreneurs, another historically completely understudied and under-regarded community. I also think we do a bad job in the field of management of paying attention to social class. And I think there's huge opportunity to really explore that further. Disability, again, 100% ignored. And I just got some funding to look at LGBTQ board directors, and so I started to do a scan of like LGBTQ anything, you know, whether it's entrepreneurship or whatever. There's so little out there. So I think that they're, you know, almost pick any community that's not your standard group that's covered in entrepreneurship, and you're bound to learn a lot.
Yeah,
I had neglected to mention immigrants before, but that's obviously hugely important, so thank you for bringing that up.
race too, right? I mean, we know so little about different races and how they play a role. But I wanna, I guess, caution against again overgeneralizing from one disadvantaged group to another, because the problems and challenges that they're facing are probably to some degree unique. You know, some are facing stigma, right? Others are facing other kinds of barriers. So again, I think that shows that for us, the field is wide open. You know, instead of trying to generalize what we learned from Silicon Valley to other communities, we have to pay attention to each individual community and think about their challenges and their opportunities, I think, yeah.
I think the urban-rural divide is also a huge one. People in rural areas, big opportunities there.
Thank you. Sorry for stopping the list, but I'm gonna get another.
Well, hopefully this will be a quick follow-up to Stefan's excellent point. Something that I wanted to ask you is, you've all mentioned these are obviously important topics for policy. Zeke showed a really compelling report that had zero research from what we're working on, which is troubling. And my question for you is, and I think some of you mentioned like economics does a great job at this, and part of the reason is, you know, whether we like it or not, organizations like the NBER, which puts out regular summary reports with an infographic and with information that is widely distributed, with kind of like the punchline of the findings, policy implications. Do you envision something like this for the Strategic Management Society? And if so, do you believe that that would facilitate the policy impact of especially research on these topics, which is much talked about in the media, could get picked up by various outlets, and obviously then potentially influence policy? And what would that look like if we were to organize such an endeavor collectively? Thank you.
Thank you. 1 second. Let's collect another question.
Hi, I'm not an entrepreneurship scholar, but for many years I've struggled clearly to try to understand, should we really train or educate people about entrepreneurship? I've really struggled whether we really needed to train or educate people on this field of entrepreneurship. And bottom line, we always found that the whole topic of entrepreneurship fall under these two theories: rational theory and cognitive theory. Rational means that we are trying to frame people to think in a way that they can lead themselves to get out of poverty, get out of wherever. Or cognitive, or we have to train them to have a certain type of culture so they can get out of whatever misery they are to become better. So the question for me, are these theories really guiding us or leading us to get rid of like informal economy to become more formal? Or should we consider the theories that can really help us to dig deeper, to ask ourselves, do we need entrepreneurship education? Do we need to train people to be wherever we want them to be? So this is the question I've been struggling for quite a number of years. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe you can collect the last one for this round.
Thank you. So I have a question to Zeke. You had a table about liability foreigners and like labor. For me, I'm very interested in the liability of foreigners and the immigrants, because liability of foreigners came from IB, that they talk a lot about the expansion of the operation in different countries. But now when we look at the immigrant entrepreneurship, it's more at the individual level, and how the liability of foreigners has implications on these immigrants that, like, do they actually have a liability of foreignness, or do they just have a different network, or like, can this theory be translated into the immigrant entrepreneurship literature?
Thank you. Well, Saraya.
I'll start with the research translation portion. I mean, I think the journals are starting to do that. Like, there are lots of Academy of Management Discoveries does cute little videos, and I think the journals are really starting to do that. What I wonder is if our societies like SMS or Academy, which is much bigger, are already too big. Like, it's harder to have like a clear point of view on something because there's so many points of view to have. And so I wonder, that's why, again, I want to turn to the research centers. I feel like when you have a topical research center and it can put out the infographic and the press release and the video or have a public event around, and they're known for a topic, I think it becomes easier to see them as a source of expertise on something. And so I think while the societies are all trying this, I think the SMS has been very serious about this. You know, ASQ has its great blog. I think Lamar is now at Organization Science starting, you know, to have a Substack. I think there's these efforts to do this, but it may be harder for our societies to do it because we're too big. The Bureau is like a place and it has a specific topic area. But I think this effort at translation is important, and I don't think we as individuals necessarily need to be doing that, especially if you're a doctoral student or assistant professor. Your number one job still, because that's how our incentives are aligned, is to publish the papers that can get you tenure. And until those incentives change, you know, I don't want you to spend hours and hours and hours trying to craft a perfect infographic or write something up. But probably your organization, your school already has people who do that, the marketing team and stuff. And so I would make friends with those folks as opposed to trying to go on your own on that front. Sorry, that was long.
So we just had a retreat of SMJ editors, and we did talk about perhaps doing something like that at the journal level to translate it. The only little thing I would say is that a lot of the efforts we're doing are like, here's a cute summary of a paper using different language than the paper uses, but as opposed to, let's put together what we're learning cumulatively about a field, like whether it's M&A, entrepreneurship. We don't have much of that. So I think, and also, what I've learned in trying to engage with audiences is that there's a certain cadence and frequency of content that they want, or you become irrelevant. And so we're very sporadic, right? We might put a video abstract, but I think you need to be pushing. It's a bit annoying because it's this beast that needs to be fed. But if we had this cadence of, look, once a month we come out with a report on here's the latest we've learned about entrepreneurship, or even once a year, here, you know, here's in our top 5 journals what's come out. I think that's what it should look like, but I kind of agree with Sarah about who should be doing it. Just quickly on your question on liability of foreignness, I think it does translate at the individual level to some extent, but I think it's too simplistic to say that foreign-born entrepreneurs or foreign-born individuals have liabilities in all aspects. For example, one of the reasons I think that foreign-born people are disproportionately involved in entrepreneurship and innovation is because they also have certain advantages that the foreignness experience exposes you to different knowledge spheres and then allows you to see things perhaps that someone who isn't a mover can't see. So I think we have to distinguish between advantages and liabilities of foreignness, but also in what dimension. Are we talking about funding? Are we talking about ideation? Are we talking about being able to recruit? So I think in the different activities that an entrepreneur has to do, there's going to be some advantages and some disadvantages of being foreign, which I guess gives you a whole research agenda, right? Because you could disaggregate the foreignness into different activities, and each one of those would be a different paper.
Valentina, I think I see merit in your suggestion in that I think we need to take collective action to have an impact. It's harder for us individually to figure out ways to reach these new channels that we're not used to reaching. Our resources, individual resources, our individual abilities, incentives, access to networks may not be sufficient. This is where we probably have to invest in organizational, institutional capabilities that help us reach those channels more effectively, kind of magnify our voices. That's not where our strengths are, at least not currently. So I see some merit, but I don't know if the right mechanism is through the through our societies or maybe other more targeted attempts. As far as entrepreneurship training, I think if I didn't think entrepreneurship training mattered, I wouldn't be a professor. So I think that's kind of our premise, that we are trying to help with our knowledge and training. There is enough research that shows that, I mean, I don't know if you can make people into entrepreneurs, but there are certain skills that you can provide that seems to make a difference. That's what we are also finding. I don't know if I'm getting the question right, but I understand that it could be context specific. Not every entrepreneur has to follow the same template. So there needs to be sensitivity to what a specific entrepreneur needs. At the same time, I do believe that we have value to add. Yeah.
I'll talk about the liabilities of foreignness question first. Connected with Prospero, which is an organization that works with Latin American entrepreneurs, and they, a lot of them are entrepreneurs back in their home countries, and maybe it's because they operate in the informal economy or what, but then, right, they don't understand a lot of the legalities and such of operating in the U.S., so they have to learn all of that. So there's that disadvantage there that they're having to figure out. So that's definitely one thing that they're trying to work on. In terms of training, educating entrepreneurs, exactly the same sort of comments, stated a slightly different way. I'm not trying to train or educate an entrepreneur. I'm trying to train or educate a more successful entrepreneur. And we talked about all the risks and failure and uncertainty associated with entrepreneurship, and I think there are things that we can teach. We can teach entrepreneurs how to better communicate and convey a vision to attract resources, funding. We can help them learn what they should be evaluating about opportunities so that they can better identify more attractive opportunities. We can teach them about ways to mitigate risks. So not necessarily trying to force anybody into an entrepreneurial career, but trying to teach those that are interested in entrepreneurship about how they can be more successful in that endeavor.
Can I add something really quickly to that? So the case of Chile is very interesting. If you go up, look up what Startup Chile has done. Chile is a country that had tremendous inequality and no culture of entrepreneurship because it always depended on natural resources like mining and fishing and agriculture. And it had essentially like 10 families that control the economy. So anyone smart in Chile was told to be a professional or go work for one of the large business groups there. So interestingly, the government started an accelerator called Startup Chile to attract foreign-born entrepreneurs, give them a visa to live in Chile for 2 years, $40,000 in funding. But interestingly, the main goal wasn't necessarily to grow a foreign-born startup in Chile. It was to bring these entrepreneurs and have them interact with local youth to promote cultural change, the idea that it was okay to be an entrepreneur. And there's some pretty good research showing that, in fact, it has accomplished that. And so I would say it's not just about skill teaching or forcing people into entrepreneurship, but sometimes it's just about culture, creating a cultural change that then allows those who have the propensity for it to be an acceptable choice.
Thank you. More questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate the presentations. I learned a lot from each of the presentations, and I feel like each of you focus on very different topic: incarceration, immigration, and racial minority. So the question I have is more like a comment about inclusive entrepreneurship. When we talk about making entrepreneurship more inclusive, we're treating entrepreneurship as an alternative route that can help those people who are disadvantaged in wage employment to do better, to have some options. But I think fundamentally, rather than saying we want inclusive entrepreneurship, what we really want is inclusive organizations or inclusive society. So I have a paper with Olenka. We show that when organizations provide more opportunities to racial minorities to start new business inside the organizations, they actually do better. They're more likely to react to those opportunities, and they are more financially successful inside the organization than outside. If you just compare the two options, when you have the resources from the organization to start a business, or take your own risk to go out to start a new business, when you don't have a lot of financial resource, human capital from the job before, it's actually harder. So I think it makes sense to say, okay, people can strike on their own when they don't have resources, then because compared to against their disadvantage in wage employment, yes, they have to strike on their own. So it's more like it's a push. They're pushed into entrepreneurship and they're forced to do that. But the fact that they can use that as an option doesn't justify that that should be the option we focus on. So I think the point I really want to drive home is that there's still a lot we can do by focusing on making organizations more inclusive.
Any reaction? Yeah.
I'll just say, hello. I'll just say that I completely, and your paper was one of the ones that I discussed at the Academy. I think that's exactly the point of the question, why entrepreneurship? Like, we shouldn't over-glorify that, and maybe that gets back to your point as well, which is, are we trying to help people be entrepreneurs, or are we trying to think about what is a more inclusive economy where people get to have the job that they want in the setting that they want and not be forced into Plan B entrepreneurship because, you know, you're a woman and the organization isn't flexible enough for you because you are responsible for most of the care work at home, as an example. So I really do think that when we talk about entrepreneurship, we need to talk about it in the broader notion of creating a more inclusive economy. And so I fundamentally agree with that. I think for many people want to do it, entrepreneurship is great. And we also need to think about the rest of the economy that shapes the entrepreneurial opportunities.
I just add that sometimes the only path to that is through entrepreneurship, right? I spend a lot of time in South America, you know, Argentina, Chile, and in some of those economies, there is no way to make the current system and the current organizations more inclusive. It's entrepreneurs who create them and change the culture. So sometimes it's both. But I agree with the premise that the goal isn't for everyone to be an entrepreneur. That's not the goal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's 12:31. So join me and thank all the panelists. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining us. Enjoy the conference.